When I first heard about the ancient tattoos of the Philippines, I didn't understand why people spoke about them with so much emotion. They said these tattoos were not just marks on the skin, but symbols of courage, beauty, and history. I wanted to see them for myself, to understand their meaning not from books or photos, but from the heartbeat of the people who carried them. That's how my journey to Kalinga began. I remember the long road that twisted up the mountains. The air grew cooler and the view stretched endlessly. Rice terraces shaped like green stairways hugged the hills. Every turn felt like stepping further back in time. The locals I met along the way smiled warmly, their faces sun-kissed, their voices soft but full of life. I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness because I was heading to meet the legendary tattoo artist of the mountains, Apo Whang-Od, the last Mamba Batok, the last traditional tattoo artist of her kind. I had read about her in magazines and seen her photos online, but nothing could prepare me for what I was about to feel when I finally saw her. After hours of hiking through narrow paths and crossing hanging bridges that swayed over rivers, I reached Buscalan village. The sound of roosters, laughter of children, and distant hum of motorbikes filled the air. The entire village seemed to breathe tradition. When I arrived at Apo Whang-Od's small wooden house, my heart raced. There she was. Small in frame, her skin lined with age and wisdom, yet her eyes sharp and bright like the mountain sky. Around her, young women, her grandnieces, were learning her art, tapping ink into skin using thorns and bamboo sticks. I sat quietly watching, feeling both reverence and awe. I realized that this wasn't just about tattoos. It was about preserving a legacy that refused to die. But Whang-Od smiled at me, her face calm but strong. She spoke softly in her local dialect, and one of her apprentices translated for me. She asked if I wanted to receive a tattoo. I nodded, though a part of me trembled inside. She chose a design, a pattern of lines and dots that represented strength, journey, and connection to ancestry. She said, "This tattoo is not decoration, it is who you are." As she began tapping the ink into my skin with a thorn dipped in soot and water, the sound echoed through the small hut. Tap, 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 slow, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The pain was sharp at first, but then it became a rhythm, almost like meditation. Every tap felt like a message from the past being written into my body. I thought about the warriors who once carried these same marks, the women who bore them with pride, and the generations who lived and died under the same mountain sun. I felt small, humbled, but also connected, as if time had folded and the ancestors were there, watching. The villagers gathered around, smiling, curious about how I would react. I smiled back even when my arm throbbed. One woman told me that each tattoo tells a story. It could be bravery in battle, achievement in life, or a spiritual connection. They were earned, not chosen. That's when I understood the tattoo was not just a souvenir. It was a responsibility. As the tapping continued, I thought about my own story, why I came here, what I was searching for. I realized that sometimes we go far from home to find something already inside us. The courage to keep moving, the will to understand who we are. Halfway through the process, Apo Whang-Od stopped, looked at me, and smiled. She said something that her apprentice translated as, "Now you carry a piece of Kalinga with you." I almost cried. The simplicity of her words carried a weight I'll never forget. If you've been watching this far, I want to pause for a moment and say this. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share this story with your friends, and leave a comment about what courage means to you. Your support helps us keep telling stories that connect hearts and cultures, stories that remind us of how beautiful our world can be when we listen to each other. Now back to my journey. When the tattoo was done, Apo Whang-Od wiped the ink gently and looked at her work with pride. The design was simple but powerful. I stared at it, feeling like I carried centuries of history on my skin. Later, I sat outside her house watching the sunset. The sky turned golden orange and the mountains seemed to glow. Around me, children played, elders talked, and life moved slowly but meaningfully. I realized that here, everything had purpose. Even the smallest action, a greeting, a smile, a tattoo, was part of something sacred. I talked with some of the villagers that evening. They told me stories of how tattoos once marked warriors returning from battle, how women received them as a sign of beauty and maturity. But as times changed, fewer people wanted them. Modern life had reached even these mountains. Still, thanks to Apo Whang-Od, the tradition survived. She taught the younger generation not just how to tap ink, but how to respect the meaning behind each design. She reminded them that culture lives only when shared. The next morning, I woke up early. Mist covered the village, and roosters crowed in the distance. I felt the sting of my new tattoo, but it made me smile. I walked around Buscalan again, taking photos and talking to more locals. They showed me rice terraces they built by hand, paths they've walked since childhood, and their daily routines that seemed simple yet full of peace. I learned that the beauty of Kalinga is not only in its mountains, but in its people. Strong, humble, and deeply connected to the land. Before leaving, I went back to see Apo Whang-Od one last time. She was sitting on a wooden bench, sunlight hitting her face. I thanked her, but she just smiled and nodded as if to say, "It's all part of the journey." She placed her hand on my tattoo and whispered something I couldn't fully understand, but her eyes said everything. I felt tears rising again. I didn't want to leave. As I walked down the narrow path leading out of the village, I looked back and saw her house getting smaller and smaller. I thought about how one woman, now more than 100 years old, had carried her people's culture on her shoulders and shared it with the world. That is real strength. On the way down, I met other travelers, some from other countries, all drawn here by the same desire to touch something real, something pure. I told them what it felt like, how the pain of the tattoo faded but the memory stayed. They listened carefully, as if trying to imagine it, but I knew that words could only do so much. To truly understand, you have to be there. To hear the tapping, to feel the sting, to breathe the mountain air. When I finally reached the lowlands, I looked at my arm again. The tattoo had started to heal. The lines were dark and crisp. I ran my fingers over it and thought of all the people who once wore these same symbols. They were warriors, dreamers, mothers, fathers, people who believed that every mark had meaning. In a world that changes so fast, I realized how rare it is to find traditions that still hold the same power they did hundreds of years ago. Kalinga taught me that beauty is not about perfection. It's about meaning. The people here live simply, but their culture is rich beyond measure. They've turned pain into art, memory into skin, and history into heartbeat. Sometimes I think about what Apo Whang-Od said, that my tattoo is a piece of Kalinga, and she was right. Because every time I look at it, I remember not just the pain, but the peace I felt in those mountains. I remember the laughter of children, the songs of the elders, the warmth of strangers who became friends. This journey changed me. It taught me that tattoos, like life, are not about what